Thank you so much. Good morning still, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the Vision Summit. My name is Radina Valova, as Lorraine said. I am Vice President of IREC's regulatory program, and I work with our amazing team on interconnection hosting capacity analysis and integrated distribution planning issues across the country. And I'm going to introduce my esteemed panelists in a moment. First, to set the stage for what we will be talking about. Our first panel had amazing discussions around what is the role of interconnection in our clean energy future. What are some of the big picture challenges we're facing with integrating distributed energy resources? And what are some of the potential solutions for making sure that they serve as positives to the grid? This panel, we're going to dig in with more detail on the specific topic of interconnection. And I think we'll have perspectives ranging from research to the utility perspective, to the advocacy perspective, to the developer perspective. And I think one of the things that unites all of those perspectives is that we need interconnection procedures at their foundation to be clear and transparent and applicable statewide. And you want to be able to, when you open an interconnection tariff, to navigate that table of content so you know if you want to learn about what are the timelines in your state, you know which page number to go to or which section. If you want to know the costs, if you want to know the dispute resolution process, like that's the very, very minimum that we would start with by asking. But on top of that, there's the whole question of how do you design each of those elements? Timelines have specific best practices attached to them. Cost allocation does. Dispute resolution. Each one of the provisions that go into interconnection procedures are complex and have their own set of considerations. And our panel, although we will absolutely not have time to go through every single issue related to interconnection, will touch on the design and the importance of some of the elements around interconnection. So I'm going to begin with Samantha Weaver with the Coalition for Community Solar Access, who's joining us virtually. Sam leads CCSA's engagement in policy discussions and regulatory proceedings related to interconnection, grid planning, cost allocation, and grid modernization. And prior to joining CCSA, Sam worked with East Bay Community Energy, where she led initiatives aimed at low-income customers and launched their first community solar program. And prior to that, Pacific Gas and Electric, where she held policy and strategy-focused roles. Sitting to my left is Brad Klein, senior attorney at the Environmental Law and Policy Center, where he leads ELPC's clean energy team and develops and promotes ambitious policies to modernize the energy grid, accelerate renewables, reform energy markets, and decarbonize the economy. Next to Brad is Sky Stanfield, partner at Schutt, Mahaly and Weinberger, amazing attorneys who also represent IREC as our subject matter experts in regulatory proceedings across the country. Sky has extensive experience in grid modernization, interconnection, and energy storage, and intervenes in such proceedings across the United States. And she participates in rulemakings before public service commissions, has worked before the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, all surrounding the creation of the foundational policies for integrating distributed energy resources with the grid. Next to Sky is Pearl Donahue-Vallet, a senior manager of strategy at Pepco Holdings, where she is responsible for a team that develops strategy and programs for climate and emerging technologies, including solar interconnection. Prior to joining Pepco, Pearl was a senior associate at the Brattle Group. And next to Pearl is Julieta Giraldez, my apologies, director of grid planning at Kavala, where she focuses on solving integrated grid planning challenges and the way in which DERs interact with the grid. And prior to joining Kavala, Julieta worked with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, where she led DER integration related projects. So please welcome our wonderful panel this morning. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to start with an easy question. What, in your view, do you believe are some of the key challenges with distribution interconnection? And I think we'll begin with Sam and then go to Brad after that.
Thanks, Radina. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you. So Hi, everyone. Thanks for having all of us, and thank you especially for allowing me to participate virtually. This is an excellent platform, at least from my end. So again, I hope you all can hear me. Um, as Radina said, I'm Samantha Weaver. I'm the director of Grid Integration and Interconnection Policy at the Coalition for Community Solar Access. In terms of the question here, you said this was an easy question, but I think that there's a lot of different ways we could take this, but I'm going to focus on, the community solar perspective in particular, because I think this is maybe a little bit unique. And, I'd say for us, the key challenge is it sort of boils down to the sheer volume of interconnection applications that utilities often receive when a community solar program in particular first opens, and the diminishing hosting capacity associated with that, right? You get a community solar program open, suddenly there's a huge influx of interest, and the available hosting capacity goes away really quickly. Just a couple of anecdotes about that. This year, for example, New Mexico opened its community solar program. It's a 200 megawatt program, and they received applications for the program equivalent to more than double that program capacity. Similarly, in the Midwest, Illinois expanded its program capacity to 450 megawatts, but they've got 1.5 gigawatts on a wait list from previous years. Um, Delmarva Power over in Delaware received over 250 megawatts of interconnection applications over a 2-day period when their community solar program first opened a few years ago. And as point being, states across the country experience this dynamic. And I think to put a broad, or maybe it's a finer point on the problem here and why all of this matters, the National Community Solar Partnership has a goal to power 5 million households by 2025 with community solar. Somewhat similarly, my organization, CCSA, wants to see 30 gigawatts installed by 2030. So we've got a lot of work to do in the near term to meet those goals and make sure we can bring on as many of these projects online as possible. So I'll leave it there for now.
And thank you so much, Sam. Before we move on to Brad, our keynote panel, and you just raised the issue of hosting capacity. Before we proceed, can I get a show of hands if this is a new term to you, or you'd appreciate a refresher on what hosting capacity is? Or are we all good in the room? Did I see a hand back there? No? Wonderful. Okay, let us proceed. Brad, on to you.
What a pleasure to be in a room where nobody has a question about hosting capacity. All right, I'm gonna go wonky. We're with our people here. I guess I'll start. I think the question is like, what is one of the greatest challenges here? And we're gonna move into solutions. But I think some context. So personally, one of my very first regulatory energy cases was in 2006 in Illinois to sort of help create the very first state interconnection standards in Illinois, and which was one of the first ones in the Midwest. I think actually Minnesota was earlier. They were a leader there. But the Energy Policy Act of 2005 directed state utility commissions, it amended PURPA, it said, please consider adopting net metering standards and consider adopting statewide interconnection standards. So a bunch of commissions at that time opened dockets, and many of those states had never considered this at all before, but there was a lot of activity at the time. And there was some guidance. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission had adopted small generator interconnection procedures. The order that came out of FERC said, states, this applies to transmission level interconnections, but you should use it as guidance. Look at it. Think about the concepts, right? So a lot of states did, including us in Illinois, and including several other Midwest states and states across the country. Now, that was 2006, right? The market, the technology, everything about distributed energy resources was completely different in 2006 than it is in 2023 and will be going forward. Yet the fundamental policy framework we have today for interconnection is based on that exact same framework. right? It was developed for a different time and a different world. And so let me just highlight one of the core assumptions in that framework, right? It treats interconnecting DERs as sort of a novelty that, like, those folks who, may want to put solar on the roof or something, they're doing something different, special, something extraneous to the utility. They should pay for it. It's going to just benefit them. And the utility, yeah, we think the utility should accommodate that. And, but they should pay for it, and the utility's going to treat it on a one-off basis and just take care of that one project. That's the core assumption. And that today is completely at odds with all of our state goals, right? And so many of it, we recognize a decentralized distributed energy future. High penetration of DERs on the distribution grid and the bulk system is needed, right? But we're relying on this outdated policy framework that assumes this is still a novelty. It's unplanned, it's one-off, it's sequential, it's not, and that does not make sense anymore. So we can and must continue to improve the interconnection screens and the process and make it better. We got to do it, but that fundamentally isn't going to solve the problem until we change the core assumptions about our interconnection framework. Just one quick anecdote, like this outdated assumption leads to all these weird, skewed incentives and policies, and just one case that we're working on now is looking at a gas rate case. In that gas rate case, the state of Illinois and probably many other states subsidize new line extensions for new construction for gas lines, right? If a developer wants to build a house, the utility will run not only a main, but it'll run a feeder, a new gas line extension. The developer doesn't pay for that. The customer doesn't pay for that. The rate base pays for that. That can run upwards of $20,000 per new home, right? Thousands of these happen every year. Nobody's talking about cost causer principles there, yet that is a new cost in the system. And not only that, it's diametrically opposed to where we want to go with decarbonization policy. If that same developer wanted to build an all-electric home, put solar panels on the roof, right? They would have to pay for they'd have to pay for the distribution system upgrades, the interconnection, all of it. So it's just like this skewed idea. We're going to talk about solutions, right? But fundamentally, I think we got to fix that, and we got to think about distributed energy resources and interconnection being a core part of the utility model going forward, a core part of the regulatory framework where there is an expectation and a duty to accommodate equitably access to the grid, right? And do it not only because it's the right thing to do for customers to allow them to equitably access the grid, but it comes with an obligation also to operate and coordinate the fleet of DERs on the system to create benefits for the whole system and for everybody. And that's not going to come without planning. And we'll get into that more. But that is the challenge, I think, the core challenge. And then I think the solution, which we'll talk about a lot more, and we'll talk about examples in states, is integrated distribution planning built around the concept that equitable access to DERs is a core utility function that commissions are responsible to guide to, utilities have to deliver on, and that is the center of focus of our advocacy.
Thank you. That is certainly building on top of what Sam said, a lot for us to think about. It's not just about fixing individual provisions in interconnection rules. It's about a systemic overhaul. What about you, Julieta? Oh, and can I also say, Brad, I really did appreciate your call out to the Midwest. We did choose to host the conference here as opposed to, we usually host it in DC because we wanted to highlight the fact that this is a region in which interconnection is not perfect. I mean, you saw the Freeing the Grid scorecard. It's not really perfect anywhere, but there are a lot of great efforts being done here by a lot of great people and institutions.
Thank you, Radina. I'm very excited to be here today. Radina said, what are the key challenges, but she only let us pick one. And so we had to coordinate. And I totally agree on the ones that have been mentioned. Definitely big supporter of integrated grid planning, proactive distribution planning, But the key challenge that I picked today in order to support that is that it has been mentioned already this morning in the first panel by Utopia, is that lack of grid transparency as the first sort of step to understanding how we better communicate in achieving these common goals and in the interconnection process. And so I think it is the grid that we have today, but also the grid in the near future that we need to understand. And Marcus Guerra also alluded to this morning. Things are changing very fast. And developers are wanting to know what the status is today, but also in 12 months, in 24 months, so that they can also plan for their financing and for what the grid is going to look like. And so I think we have made great progress with hosting capacity maps. They are a right step forward, but we need to understand that hosting capacity is a dynamic concept. Every time we change the load or the generation assumption that we have in our models, the result changes. Every time we change the configuration of the grid, the result changes. And so I think we need to really think about how do we make this information and this moving forward toward this grid transparency and grid data that we're putting out there, making the data more useful. And so the usefulness of the data, I think, is very important for many different reasons. First of all, so that we can better understand how the DER developers and customers can design their systems to meet those constraints or grid needs. But also, I was trying to think, hosting capacity maps, red, orange, or green, right? So red, how red? Is it $5,000 red that I can get with my neighbors and in 3 months we solve this? Or is it 5-year red and $10 million project? And the same with the yes or no type situation where we are now a little bit stuck in the interconnection. Is it no at 10 kilowatts, but yes at 9.9? Or if I change, now, so we really need to move forward into how can we make this big push towards these data portals and grid transparency really useful to improve that interconnection process.
Thank you so much. And Pearl, you are up.
Thanks, Radina. So I wanted to first tell folks what Pepco Holdings is, because that is not a term that you'll find very many places. And my name tag otherwise would be so long. My last name is already outrageously long, but if every time someone referred to me, they had to say Pearl Donahue Villette, Pepco, Delmarva, Atlantic City Electric Power, because I represent all of those companies and have the pleasure across working all those states, but that is just too long. So we just call it Pepco sometimes, or Pepco Holdings. So that's who Pepco Holdings is. And I will say I'm really happy to be here and happy to be at every conference that is predominantly focused with solar and DER advocates, both because I enjoy the spicy language that happens, I enjoy that, but because I think that the partnership between DER advocates and the utilities are so important. We've seen some successes as Pepco Holdings where we've put in some big filings to change cost allocation. We did that with solar partners in the District of Columbia. We're pushing that with our solar partners in Maryland. We were able to open up hosting capacity in our Atlantic City Electric service territory with a massive investment into system protection because we had support from SEIA and we had support from our local solar developers. Without that, if we spend all of our time arguing with each other and none of our time finding the common ground, and there is so much common ground, then we're not really going to make progress. So I'm always happy to be at events like this and be able to have those conversations to build more and more of that common ground. So for my challenge, I'm really going to focus from a utility viewpoint and tell you a little bit about the changes that all of this takes in a utility. I'm going to call back to Sam and to Brad on this one because yes, there are a lot of applications. We have a series of essentially 4 smaller utilities and we process more than 10,000 applications every year. That is a lot of applications. That is a lot of applications for a relatively small engineering staff. We actually have more than 500 megawatts in our Delaware queue right now. And as Sam said, I think it was 350 of that actually came within a 24-hour period. How do you staff How do you build systems? How do you build workforce? How do you invest in the monitoring, control equipment, in the proactive planning, fundamental changes in the utility business? These are not small drives. These are not small efforts. These are not small initiatives. The utility model transformation and the utility staffing and that business transformation that's needed is incredibly difficult. You can have it good, you can have it fast, or you can have it cheap. If we want it to be good and we want it to be fast, utilities need to continue to build within our organizations and are going to continue to look for support to build within our organization the tools and the teams so that collectively we can all get things on the system a lot faster.
Thank you. And I think I feel like interconnection workforce has come up. I've certainly had conversations, so that's definitely, I think, a shared constraint that a lot of folks are feeling. Thank you. Sky?
Thank you, and welcome everybody. I'm so happy to see all your faces here talking all day about interconnection. It's like a girl's fantasy. It's so exciting. So I'm going to start by trying to push the boundary a little bit and building a lot on what Brad was saying. I think that we as IREC participate in interconnection proceedings all over the country. I think I've done 30 or more states at this point, and currently, I think when we're in the interconnection proceedings, there's one underlying reality that's mostly being ignored, and that's that the basic foundational framework for the interconnection procedures and process was built for, say, a single family home, and we're trying to put a skyscraper on top of it. And that foundation is not being paid attention to. Instead, we're trying to put some plaster here, maybe a support beam here, and instead it's time for us to take a look at whether that basic foundation is going to be able to support what we're trying to do. And having done a lot of these proceedings, I am quite confident that it is not going to be able to just simply, and what I'm referring to in particular is the idea that we review interconnection applications one by one. And the idea that we can process the volume of applications that Pearl just mentioned, whether it's for small projects or large projects, singularly in this manner, I just don't think that there's any way that foundation can function. And yet, when you're in the interconnection proceedings, most of what's done is to try to do that little piece of plaster, an extra support. What if we add a few more staff? But ultimately, I think it's time for us here at the Vision Summit especially to start asking whether that foundation is really going to be able to support where we want to go. I think when we look at what states are doing in the interconnection process and the proceedings, we look at each of those individual processes. We might add a group study, we might add a couple screens or try to accelerate it, but all of those kind of ignore the interactive relationship of the grid that is a dynamic grid, and particularly treat DERs as dumb. We really have so much innovation that we can do with DERs, and we talk about, oh, we're doing some smart inverter things, but we're not thinking system-wide when we review individual applications. We're still thinking about them one by one, instead of looking at if we did 20 or 30 or a whole feeder's worth of systems, how could that change how they would interconnect and what upgrades would be required. And what Brad highlighted, and we'll talk a lot about this probably throughout the day, is we want to do proactive upgrades and we need to move towards planning. But I want to highlight that that's actually not quite an interconnection solution. That's getting the grid built out, but we're still going to have to figure out how to review the projects that connect after those upgrades are done. So what I want to call everybody out today to do is to not just think of like those little fixes that we love to work on, for sure, and start questioning what would be a totally different way of thinking about how to look at each project. Do we have to look at them one by one? Is there a different way we can envision that process, which will be more sustainable as we start connecting hundreds and thousands of projects across the United States?
Okay, so those are just one challenge per panelist, but I feel like we could spend probably an entire week talking about the solutions to each one. Thank you so much because they're enormously complex. I'm hearing your responses center around we can't just do little fixes. We have to do a broader overhaul. We have to integrate distribution planning. We need to have the resources to do that, both staffing and internal systems. We need to have better data. So you've, in a sense, already touched on some of the solutions within your responses regarding the challenges, but now I'm going to turn really concretely onto solutions. If you were to, if we were to all to put ourselves in the shoes of regulators right now who maybe are launching an interconnection docket tomorrow, and you have to decide how to tackle the universe of issues and challenges that we just discussed. So let's put our regulator hats on, or rather put your advisor hats on. What would you advise regulators do to prioritize tackling the challenges that we've just addressed? And I'd like to start with Pearl and then go on to Brad.
So I hope none of my commissioners or board members are here. I don't think so. So what I would start by saying is that our regulators are in an incredibly difficult position. Our regulators have been asked not only to run all of the regulatory proceedings that they have been running for decades, but now they've been given massive policy mandates, and in some cases without entirely clear guidance on implementation. They are in an incredibly difficult position. Our legislators are driving, our communities are driving. The transition is coming, we all want it to come, and our regulators have become this point where all of it comes to a head. So they're in a tough spot. If I was going to provide some advice to my commissioners, or maybe I'd say commissioners in another state, I don't want to talk about my own commissioners in another state, I would say there's 3 buckets that I would prioritize. First, easy wins. There are low-hanging fruit that we could just be done with. I think Catherine and I were talking about some last night where like the utility has said, we want to change this. Solar industry said, we want to change this. And it's stuck in a working group for 3 years. I would also prioritize pilots. We all got to learn. Let's get pilots moving quickly. If it is a relatively small dollar pilot, let's go out, let's try it, let's learn. Utilities learn by doing. I think everyone is always frustrated when they come to the utility and they say, but someone in California, I hope you still, someone in California did this. And we say, well, but we're not California, and we have different capabilities, and we have different tools. Utilities learn by doing. Let us get those pilots, let us learn, let's move forward. And the third that I would say is all that stuff in the middle, the midterm, let's put it down to the side. What we need is proactive planning, and I actually fundamentally disagree. I think that proactive planning is so related to interconnection because what we see are bigger and bigger grid upgrades. And you see this especially on the transmission system now. You're getting deeper and deeper upgrades on the system. That is coming to the distribution system. In order for interconnection to go quickly, we need to have our systems proactively planned. And that is a fundamental change in the way that utilities work. That is a fundamental change for many of our regulators. So if we're not focused and laser focused on how do we get proactive planning, and then how do we do cost allocation for that planning, and we get distracted with the other 50 things that we could be talking about, we're not going to get where we want to go on interconnection. We're not going to get where we want to go on decarbonization. We're not going to get where we want to go on electrification. So I would give them 3 buckets. If it's not in those 3 buckets, put it to the bottom of the list.
Thank you. I really appreciate that you provided an answer that touches on both like what issues to address as well as how to go about structuring. If you were scoping out a proceeding, you know, do low-hanging fruit, make sure proactive planning is in there. Thank you. Brad.
Yeah, well, first, I mean, +1 on Pearl's point earlier about like finding common ground, and because everything you said, I completely agree with, and I think, isn't it nice to be past like the exhausting net metering battles of 10 years ago, and you know where advocates and utilities were just like grinding each other to pieces? Like, this is an opportunity really to move some things that I think serve the public's interest serve clean energy, in the climate, in the globe's interest, and can help make utilities really important part of getting there. So what do we do? What do we want commissioners to do? Well, if I could just wave a magic wand somehow and say all right, we're going to update the 100-year-old regulatory compact entirely and make equitable access to distributed energy resources a core function of public utility service, done, right? We're done. That'd be great. Pearl, you'd be out there with your team, making it happen. The regulators would be reviewing to see, what's going on, and you'd make money from that, and we'd be interconnecting all over the place. That's not going to happen overnight. I hope it happens. I hope we get there. And there's work around the edges. We're making progress. The Minnesota Public Utility Commission, for example, just this year ruled in a case that the Just Solar Coalition intervened in, and ELPC represented this. They recognize that energy justice and equity is a core part of the just and reasonable standard used to evaluate electric utility rate cases. So there's that kind of thing is happening. We're going to make more progress. But practically, tomorrow, what can regulators do? I mean, I think number one, let's just start measuring hosting capacity. Let's look at the service territory. That can be done. It should be being done. Some utilities are doing it, but let's look at it in a granular way, feeder by feeder, neighborhood by neighborhood, looking both at load and generation hosting capacity, and then examine it. Look for disparities. Look for places that, and if you can, overlay it with demographic data about the neighborhoods and communities that are being served. Are you finding, some disparities in quality of service, access to renewables, reliability, disconnection data? Let's know what we're doing. Let's take stock of where we are today, right? And then let's look at our state goals. States that have aggressive decarbonization or DER deployment goals, what would it take to get there? And we heard about that a little bit today. So then map that against your hosting capacity of your system. What would it take to hit our goals? Are we anywhere close with the grid we have today of being able to do that? And if not, start planning for how you get there, and make hosting capacity one of the elements of the prioritization model that the utility is using to plan their distribution system investments. The level of hosting capacity necessary to hit your state targets, think about that, and then insert that into your prioritization model. Plan for the type of the type of investments needed to get there proactively, and then file that with your regulators and make the case that if we're going to hit our goals, we have to do this, because waiting for it to happen and putting it on the backs of customers to show up one by one, studying them sequentially, is I think there was a quote today, it's going to take 200 years on the transmission system. It's going to probably be, similar. We're never going to hit our goals. It's unrealistic. So those are some concrete things. Measure where you are, right? Look for disparities, get your targets in place, and make a plan to invest in the grid to enable that to materialize. And then that's going to be more cost effective, it's going to be faster, right? And it'll be more equitable in the long term.
Thank you so much. Juliet, I'm going to turn to you next, and one of your core challenge related also to data in a sense. So I'd love to hear what your prioritized solution is.
It's actually a great follow-on, because you mentioned that ability to do granular planning to solve the challenges, right? And so my advice would be good data as a foundation, as the backbone of that, of being able to accomplish all of these goals. And also especially capturing now the temporal aspects that we need to capture in grid planning that we didn't used to before, right? We only cared about the peak. The peak was driven by weather and load. It's not the same now. We have all of these DERs, all of these technologies, customer adoptions, and we need to understand that time series behavior. And so I really think that this ability to use and understand time series data, so regulators pushing for this good data quality and better understanding of the data is key to reflect where the DR technologies are going, where the capabilities are, the software controls that we were talking this morning. This is sort of a foundation to be able to do these things I want to do. Otherwise, I think we're going to be always stuck with these more conservative screens. And I really do think that technology is there. Cloud computing, storage costs have come down. So we need to push for modernizing our ability to be able to get the data where it needs to, the quality, and being able to use this data in a very meaningful way. I think, at Kavala, I work at a software company where we have just shown our ability to take in AMI data, so smart meter data in California, 5-year historical, and model every single premise in the state, overlay all of the possible DERs that they might adopt in the future, and then see the grid impacts, right? And so I think going back to how this ultimately ties to this proactive planning and the interconnection process is, I think there's a little bit of a chicken and the egg with the interconnection queues right now. Mark mentioned this morning, and this happens in transmission a lot of ghost applications, people putting into interconnect in different places because developers are nervous and they don't have the information and they don't have the certainty of how the grid is going to be planned. And this happens in transmission and it happens in distribution. If we have a more clear strategy, roadmap, how we're going to accomplish this is communicated to the developers, then they'll have the certainty that they don't need to put applications in 10 different places. They'll just put it in one. So I think that is sort of, I think, a key to, and how also this proactive ties to the interconnection.
Thank you so much. I'd like to turn from the developer perspective next, Sam, and then we'll close off with Sky. So Sam, how would you recommend prioritizing solutions?
Yeah, so I'm going to build on Julieta's point there. I think that's absolutely key. And, the way that the solar developer community, at least, us here on the policy side, tend to think about things in our minds is in terms of market maturity, referring to a state's existing policy landscape, whether they've implemented, say, a community solar program or other DER sort of incentive program before. And, for states that are considering, say, a community solar program or other program for the first time, the priority needs to be related to directly what Julieta was just saying, coming up with ways to reduce clogged interconnection queues in advance. And the way to do that is by ensuring that project developers have the right information to put forward a well-founded interconnection application in the first place. I think, Julieta, you called them ghost projects. We call them zombie projects. Whatever you want to call them, they are sort of speculative interconnection applications. And the reason that those applications exist is because developers are having to submit them for speculative reasons because they have no information to go off of other than, the outcome of that application request. So specifically, what I would advise folks to do there is require utilities to publish hosting capacity maps that contain distribution asset information and are updated at least monthly. That's kind of the industry position on, what frequency is this data valuable? It's got to be more than once a year. Many states currently require utilities to publish these. Good examples exist in Massachusetts, Minnesota, Oregon, California, other places. Then the second piece, on this theme of sort of data transparency for the purpose of reducing speculative applications, is having publicly available interconnection queue data. As an aside, if I could get on a soapbox about this for a moment, many of you here in the room have likely seen all of the news articles and, New York Times pieces about the challenge of interconnecting transmission scale resources and how backlogged the transmission queues are there. And I don't know if you all have the same issue as I have, but every time I read those articles, I just think, man, I wish we had publicly available, distribution level interconnection data, because I think it would show a similar story and draw attention to a similar problem. So that's an aside. That'd be another sort of, perk of having publicly available interconnection queue data. But for developers' purposes, that needs to be available. And there are examples of states that require this. There's queue information you can find today for Duke Energy System, Hawaiian Electric Companies, Massachusetts, New York, Xcel Energy there in Minnesota, where you all are. But again, this is meant to help alleviate that initial influx of applications that are just overwhelming to existing business processes. And, I understand why that overwhelm occurs. That said, then you have to start to think about, okay, well, what if you're not a new market? What if you're a more mature market like Massachusetts or California? What do you need to be prioritizing and thinking about? And that's where I like to say that grid modernization, distribution system planning, proactively, both of those things make interconnection better. So to me, that's sort of the maturity framework for thinking about some of these solutions.
Thank you so much. I am hearing a lot today of the link between distribution planning, grid modernization, and interconnection. I guess we really can't view them as two separate things. However, Sky is going to take us back down to the interconnection level.
Yeah, and I actually wanted to respond to Pearl and on that point. Like, I think, I don't want to sound like I'm 100% proactive upgrades and the planning process. That's essential. Obviously, doing the upgrades and the delay is what causes the challenges in the connection process. But if we proactively upgrade the circuit, we still, under the current framework, have to evaluate each project that wants to connect to it. They may be able to pass through screening, but what I'm saying is maybe we need to rethink all of that. That said, I want some states to take that challenge on, but in the meantime, we got to keep chugging along with what we have. So if you're in a state, and the question is, how do you prioritize solutions? Here's my framework for what states should do when they start an interconnection proceeding. The first one is make sure you have some real data about the process that is in place now and how it's working. Too often we come in and there's like a couple people complaining about this over here and maybe a people complaining about this over here, but it's hard to prioritize because you don't have transparency on what steps in the process are people actually getting hung up on. What is the utility actually doing in those steps? What are the costs of the upgrades that are being caused? So, and again, going back to the data, now I'm not talking about data about the grid itself in the hosting capacity context, but about the interconnection process itself. So it helps if regulators can start the proceeding with having actually some transparency about the process itself and how it's working. From that, if you whether you have that data or not, you want to also understand where is your market going, not just what are your challenges today. So a lot of times we're focusing on this immediate hurdle because there are so many in interconnection, and takes 2 to 3 years to get that interconnection rule out and get the fix in place. And by that time, 3 new programs have been adopted and there's a whole new world of challenges coming up. So I always say this both to legislators and people working, for example, in the community solar space. If you are about to get a program done, you need to go work on the interconnection before it gets set up. So thinking ahead, both what your current challenges are, but where is your market going, and what do you need to do to ready the process? And then I have 4 basic questions that I think regulators should ask as they look through these things. The first one is, are you using the full capabilities of the technologies and data that is available? So are you looking at the data and really mining it and helping to understand it? And then are you actually using the technologies that DERs offer? For example, are you assuming everybody's going to be operating 24 hours a day, 365 days a year? Or are you allowing them to do scheduling? Are you taking advantage of what smart inverters can do to mitigate voltage constraints? That's question 1. Question 2 is, have you really focused on developing an effective tiered approach? And what I mean by a tiered approach is that each project doesn't require the same amount of review. We have to really get better at utilizing the screening processes and creating different off-ramps for projects, just giving them just the right amount of review instead of sort of the same cookie cutter review, because that is not, especially with the current constraints on hiring, that is not a realistic pathway. 3 is, are you providing customers with the information they need to design proper projects? My colleagues have touched on that plenty, so I'm not going to go into it, though it is a very pet issue for me. And then finally, do all parties in the interconnection process share responsibility for keeping the process moving? And by this, I mean we have to have accountability and we have to have enforceability. We have to both, that's both for interconnection customers, they need to keep up with their timelines, and for utilities. The idea that we're going to keep moving with the sort of reasonable effort standard is proven not to be effective. FERC just took the bold step of eliminating that reasonable effort standard at the federal level, and I think we need states to do that as well. So build a good process, but you have to make sure that people are accountable to keeping it moving.
Wow, okay. So I hope everyone was taking notes. You've got 5 minutes left before we go into Q&A. So I'm going to ask one final question, which is from and I don't know who wants to take the first stab here. From a process perspective, how do you make sure that as you're updating your interconnection procedures, the tariff itself, to be inclusive of the solutions we discussed today, how do you make sure that that process is aligned with the longer term planning processes? Like, how do you ensure that you're designing a long-term planning process that is aligned with your interconnection procedures and vice versa? Easy peasy.
Fund IREC to get involved in your proceedings. And I say that tongue in cheek, but I'm really actually very serious about it. I think there's a long track record of things, like you need the experts in the room, right? You need the people that have been through the process before to help guide the advocates, you know, and the regulators. So I don't have a great answer to that question. I think we have a big challenge ahead of us, and I want to just pinpoint Illinois because next month the Illinois Commerce Commission is going to issue massive orders in 2 big electric grid rate cases and grid planning dockets, and 3 gas rate cases. There is a ton of implementation work that's going to come out of that. We have a sort of interconnection working group that has had mixed success so far. That came out of the last major statute that the state passed. Sam and colleagues have been doing incredible work trying to make this interconnection working group process work well but there's going to be a ton of work dumped on that committee and dumped on the commission. We really need a plan, and I see the whole Vote Solar team is here, like Will Kenworthy and I have been sweating bullets about, like, okay, there's a mandate for sort of exploring flexible interconnection based on Durham's investments. There's a hosting capacity roadmap that the utilities have to work on, including examination of dynamic hosting capacity, right? Making it sort of a real time. Proceedings to examine virtual power plants. A DER value investigation coming along. Data access, a rulemaking on solution sourcing from non-wires alternatives based on a data access platform. Not only that, we have to figure out how to implement sort of the Justice 40 principle that was built into CEJA to ensure that the benefits from this investment are flowing equitably, right? And we got to define what are benefits. How do you track them? How do you measure progress towards them? So all of that's happening, like, starting next year. We need IREC in the room. We need all y'all in the room with us, and we need like, if we can get some of these things working well in a sort of Midwestern state that we can learn lessons and replicate elsewhere, I think that's one way to get it moving.
So thank you for that thrilling game of hot potato. I'm going to actually toss the hot potato off to Sam and see if you have anything you wanted to add, Sam, as our virtual participant.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll gladly catch that potato, and thanks to Brad for bringing up working groups first, so I didn't have to be the one to introduce that idea. And I say that kind of jokingly because I've seen working groups be very effective, and then work whatever the opposite of that is. I can't think of a good way to say that right now. And I think all that is to say that these sort of, Radina, you'd asked about sort of the process of integrating your interconnection rules that are this, dusty document sometimes that lives on a piece of paper somewhere on a website, with your actual planning processes. And I view that integration as these sort of seams issues between the two that really tend to come up through stakeholder forums. Um, and I think for better or for worse, working groups are the best place to identify those seams issues and address them. I think, however, there need to be the right there needs to be a framework and support from a commission, from regulators in place to make sure that working groups can work effectively. There are a couple of sort of best practices tools in the toolkit I've seen around that. One is requiring that there be some deliverable coming out of the working group with a set of consensus and or non-consensus recommendations. I mean, believe it or not, there are working groups where that's not part of the plan. We just sort of get together and talk, and it feels like candidly a waste of everyone's time. And there are other working groups where there is, say, a requirement to publish a report with recommendations, and that working group hasn't done it for 2 years. Illinois comes to mind for one of those, and I can see why Brad mentioned sweating bullets over all of the really important issues that are going to be delegated to that working group probably next year. And there are questions about whether or not that group is structured to handle those. So I think point being, working groups are helpful, except when they're not. So it's really important to think about the details of how they're structured, what they're required to produce, also their facilitation. I can't say enough about how important it is to have a facilitator that is invested and skilled in driving forward the process and the outcomes for those groups. And again, I've seen plenty of instances where sort of there's no one with that role, and it's not very effective. So I'll get off my working group soapbox there, but I like this topic a lot.
Thank you so much. I do appreciate that helpful soapbox. Those are all excellent points about making working groups more efficacious. We are, alas, out of time. So we would love to take questions now. If you have any questions, please come on up to the microphones.
I have two questions. I'll start with the first one. What are you all's thoughts on the minimum documentation requirements to reduce the number of zombie projects, especially considering that full project details and permits typically are delayed until after we know the results of interconnection studies?
That's a great question. Who would like to take that?
I can start off. So I call this the queue clearing basics stuff that we need to do across the United States, especially in states where you already have a lot of zombie projects. And there are best practices out there. IREC's written a number of reports that reference some of these. Some of it is starting with basic things like, do you have site control? Have you made everybody who's in the queue show that you have a site and then control it? Like really fundamental things, towards more important or more difficult and somewhat contentious provisions like, are you going to require deposits? When do you require deposits? How much? And are they refundable? You're always, without the perfect transparency into the grid, you're always going to have people, some speculative projects. And I think how aggressively you move into requiring the various layers of documentation in the process depends on how much information you've given people to work with in the beginning. So if you're saying you have to have your project 100% designed and fully figured out by the time you submit your application, but there's no way to actually do that in an informed manner, then that's an unreasonable requirement. But if you are ready to process applications quickly and people are able to design them, then you can ask a lot more from people up front. That's the sort of chicken and egg or the dance we get, is we can't say, well, everybody has to submit a big deposit and have everything figured out if there's no way for them to have done the design work ahead of time.
Would anyone else like to chime in, or shall we move on to? Yeah, quick question 2.
The follow-up for that question is, since we know that the zombie projects exist, how would group or cluster studies effectively work, since the other projects would be left holding the bag? Do we need transparency in hosting capacity first before we consider group studies?
I do love leading questions. Yes. I'm very, very serious. That was very, very well set up for us. Who would like to take that?
So I think this is one also that I would invite Sam to this conversation, because I know that our organization has been very active on this in Delaware. So we had this massive interconnection applications. We know that they're not all going to move forward. We do publish hosting capacity maps, and I should have raised my hand when you said, does everyone know what hosting capacity is? Because our hosting capacity is a stochastic calculation at the feeder head. And I don't think people really understand that, and I'm not sure that that's actually consistent across the industry. So maybe I should have raised my hand. But hosting capacity existed. We have a lot of applications that have come in, and we've had teams that have been trying to figure out, how do you do cost sharing? The community solar community has been helpful in providing feedback. CCSA has been phenomenal in helping to facilitate that process. And now there are clusters, and there's all these follow-on questions of, well, if this group study moves forward, but you have 3 on this project and then 1 drops, does that affect my funding for this upgrade, which is contingent upon that group? Because this is not the transmission world where they're 500 miles apart. We're talking about folks who are down the street from one another. A lot of our community solar is very, very clustered. Wow, is it a challenge? I don't think I've got a solid answer for it, but I know that we have to have some kind of better approach for cost allocation, because we know that it's a barrier. I don't think that group studies and group cost allocation are the only approach, but it really is a challenge that we're going to continue to work through, and there are trade-offs that all the parties are going to have to be comfortable with, and that there's going to be more sign-on at different places. So.
Can I just take a second to plug the paper that we just wrote on this? So I'm so glad you asked, Utopia, because my colleague Laura Beaton, who's here, just finished a comprehensive paper that looks at 4 or 5 case studies across the country about specifically distribution groups, not transmission cluster studies, and looks at all the elements of that need to go into that process and what makes them successful or not, and how to evaluate them in your state's context. So some of these things, like what happens when people drop out. So I really encourage everybody to check the paper out. It's on IREC's website, and it's intended, again, as a guide for you to evaluate if it's a good solution in your state, and then if you decide you want to pursue it, how to design one that works well for your state.
And can you remind me, Sky, for Utopia's question, I don't remember if we addressed zombie projects explicitly.
Well,
in
they're
the
a key
paper.
part of this question about how you form the initial groups and then what happens when people start dropping out. And we had a whole section that was added about doing that initial queue clearing as a critical part. If you don't do that before you start, the groups are going to fail and be spectacularly problematic. So they're not going to offer any benefit if you don't usher out those zombie projects at the beginning.
So wait, I'm happy to share that paper directly with you. So what am I going to go here, and then Brian?
Yeah, real quick, this is pretty simple. We talked about call sharing and areas that are close together for community solar. A lot of community solar projects, as we all know, end up on large rooftops, warehouse districts, industrial districts, et cetera. Is Exelon and/or Pepco planning for that in the future in those areas? And do you know of any other utilities that are taking that approach?
So let me answer 2 different pieces to that.
Sure.
So there's a planning aspect and there's a cost allocation aspect. And from a planning process, we have been consistent and persistent in our push to try to move towards a proactive planning process. That is a fundamental change from a regulatory perspective. And I think we all underestimate how difficult it is to get to a prudency standard for a DER forecast. That, to me, number one, shared focus that the industry should have. If we don't get that, we don't move forward. The grid won't be ready. We all know that the grid needs to be ready. So are we moving towards that? Yes, we are very much trying to move towards that. We spend 5.5 hours every other Thursday talking about it in a working group. We are trying. So yes, we are working towards that. I can't tell you that we have the solution now. I know Kavala and lots of other organizations are really helpful in thinking about what are the approaches. We did a lot of review on what are the proactive approaches that exist across states a year or two ago. One of our fundamental challenges is that there's not a good forecast outside of California that is tied to reliability.
Right.
So when you come to a forecast and you say, well, Bloomberg says this, or the state goal says that, what is the geographically specific, reliable forecast that a utility and a commission can rely on in order to support those investments? It's a really big challenge. We're working on it. From the cost allocation perspective, yes, it is also something that we're working on. You'll see it mostly in Maryland and in New Jersey right now. That's where we have the most active dockets. Because our regulators have so much going on, what we are finding is that proactive filings are really difficult to move because our commissions, again, have just so much on their plate. So those are the opportunities where we see working groups and have that opportunity. So that's where we're mostly pushing on it. But yes, we see a fundamental need for change in the way that we do cost allocation to lower barriers. And yes, we see the fundamental need to get our grids ready in order to be able to meet the states. And I will say, I live in the District of Columbia, state and district goals that we have.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Great
Thanks to the panel.
question. Thank you. I think we actually have a clarifying question from our
Yeah,
panelists as
Pearl,
well.
I want to make sure I heard what you were saying, because clearly it's really important. What I heard you say is it's really difficult to get to a prudency standard or to define the prudency standard for DER forecasts in order to support proactive distribution investments. Is that right? Is that?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Because all
Finding,
of our, so what we talked about, and this came in the first panel, where adoption is, we have state goals, and I think we often get stuck in this, where we say, like, you've got a 15% carve out for this technology, so plan for that. But I can't plan for a goal. I need to plan for customer adoption. And so we're getting to that more geographically specific customer adoption level.
You need DER forecasts that are able to be, that your regulators are able to rely on in order to support your case that it's prudent to invest in these feeders.
You got it. And we've been doing that for load for 100 years, but that's a big change from a regulatory perspective to go to that. And we all argue about load forecast too, but to get to a level that the regulators can rely on that DER forecast.
And I should say the IREC team is working on the load forecasting or electrification forecasting side at the moment to help answer that question a bit. So hopefully have some resources on that next year. I think we have time for one more question from Brian, and then we will move into breakout groups.
Okay, we got a question from online. Since many utilities serve multiple states, are they being dealt with where DERs are concerned on a company-wide basis, or are we just stuck with the state-by-state model because of the regulatory structure that they have to work within?
Can I turn this to Julieta, since you haven't had an opportunity to answer a question yet, if you feel comfortable?
So the question is more the regional planning versus the state-by-state for a utility that may operate in different states?
Or, yeah, a utility that could operate in different states, yeah.
Yeah. So I think it goes back to the discussion that we're having, right? The planning has really changed because of these customer adoptions, and the way we're having to think at the distribution level, this was never a thing. Think about policy planning, right? And so a lot of these policies are driven by the state, and then the regulatory construct that you have to respond to. And so I think actually the DOE is also thinking about how to tackle this regional and versus state planning, because they are related. Now, what happens in a different state is also affecting your state. But ultimately, I think the implementation model right now is still, the utilities have to respond to them and really are, from a construct, right, they have to meet, they're there and they're allowed to be a monopoly because they are going to meet these goals that are typically at the state level. So yeah, it is a great question, but I think it is becoming, well, definitely at the transmission level, definitely it's becoming more and more important, the regional planning. and then aligning on the states. But it is mostly now driven by, when we do our studies and load and DR forecasts, we look a lot at the state policies to drive those, then geographical adoptions at the customer level.
All right. Thank you so much to our wonderful panelists, and thank you, Sam, for joining us virtually. Good
Thank you all.
conversation. Okay, so we are now going to transition into our first breakout group. I am excited to share we're doing something a little bit different this year. Rather than beginning with a discussion, we're going to begin with the first of 3 rounds of competitive interconnection related trivia. So, panelists, if you would go back to tables.